If you're like me in your 40s and you're wondering what the hell is going on with these kids, if you're wondering why are people so difficult to work with, I've recently finished a book that really helps me understand why I was in conflict with the younger generation, why I was so confused by it, and why I maybe could to them seem at times maybe callous or a little direct or different than they were. It might be a generational and cultural issue that I find this book really helps me understand. I get to see the world from three different standpoints. It does take a little bit of, introspection to get there. But I entered the restaurant industry and the workforce when I was 17 in 1999. I had Gen Zs working for me throughout the 10s and then the 20s. And then now I have kids, one 14-year-old, the very last Gen Z, and two small ones that are alpha. With the help of this book, I get to really understand how big of a difference there is between my generation and the Gen Zs. And more than anything, having kids, I get to see how the Gen Zs came up different. Because me being a parent, I admittedly fall into the trap that the parents of Gen Zs have fallen into, causing the issues that they are now facing. How good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. The coddling of the American mind. This struck me really hard. I had recently read The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, one of the authors, which is more about the impact that social media has. But this was published before the other. I really found this to be truly enlightening for my understanding of the issues that Gen Zs are facing and that I simply had no idea about before. I will honestly say that I did find a lot of Gen Z as being self-absorbed and not really engaging in anything. And why would that be? And to me, let me remind you, my childhood was about getting shit done, and we didn't have the distractions from social media. I got a Commodore 64. There's a limit to how much distractions you can get out of that, to be honest. The book approaches all of this by stating the three great untruths that are by now settled as the reality that the young generation is facing. The idea of fragility, that they state it as being what doesn't kill you make you weaker. The second one is the untruth of emotional reasoning, as in being you should always trust your feelings. And the third is us versus them, that the world is divided in good and evil and good people and bad people. We used to look at American universities with great admiration, and now it seems like they've always been a little bit ahead of the curve, and it's a little daunting what they are showing us, because it seems like campus culture that is so vividly described in this book is telling us that things are going to go a little crazy, and that this new generation is really in a difficult position. I'm born in 1982, which makes me technically a millennial, emotionally more a Generation X. The Generation X was defined as the Latchkey kids, which meant that your clearest memory of your childhood is to have a lanyard around your neck with your key to the house, and after school you would somehow get yourself home, open up the door, nobody would be at home, you would pick up your football, grab it, walk down, go to the playground, fuck around and find out until dinner time. That was my childhood. It's very different than the childhood of the other generations coming up, particularly, obviously, the Gen Zs. Now, I entered the restaurant industry professionally at the age of 17 in the year of 1999. It was a very different time, and obviously motivated by what my childhood gave me, or maybe lacked, to be honest. My approach was very determined, ambitious, and sort of self-sufficient. I had been taught throughout my childhood that my life was very much something I needed to take responsibility for myself. And I just, kept grinding through it. Now, what's interesting, I find, is that once you take that culture out of the campus culture of university, of sort of an intellectual academic setting, and bring it into a much more real world, so to say, the practical world of restaurants or hospitality, the clashes between the generations are much more intense. Earlier generations within the restaurant industry are working class and much less academic, while in academia you have a much more progressive left-wing understanding of the world that I would say probably facilitates some of these ideas in a way that maybe is not so healthy. But the clash between the generations on university campuses is different than it is in the restaurant industry. I find that to be extremely interesting. In 2010, I opened my first restaurant, and I had my first employees being themselves millennials. So restaurant industry often have a staff that is in the young 20s. So at the time, those would be millennials, and I was from the very beginning of the millennial generation. So still within a time span of 5 to 10 years between us. And we had, I would say, a more common understanding. Then COVID struck and everything changed. I always thought that it was just because of COVID. But in reality, what I realized today is that the generational change was happening and the Gen Zs were entering the workforce. And COVID was just a moment, an explosion, or implosion, might you say, that really brought some things forward. I was so convinced that it was COVID that it was about, but I was like, what is wrong with people? What happened? But so much had been going on, and the brutal reality is that it is our responsibility as parents. And I realize that today with kids at these different ages. So I have an interaction with kids in their 20s working for me and my own kids. And I can see the links, and I understand that in the end, I almost have to deal with a 20-year-old as I deal with my 4 or 5-year-old. And that's not to try and dumb down the state of that generation or the state of someone in the 20s, but more that I'm so much more informed about what a young person needs today being a father than I was as a manager or as a chef or as an owner or whatever. And I just find that to be quite an important learning. It's clear that a kitchen environment is often toughened, and we know it to be, and it is criticized for being a tough environment. And I think to some extent rightfully so, but we have to consider a little bit why has it become like that. And when you come from academia, it's very difficult to understand it, I suppose, but the intensity is just not something that you can take out of it. And I'm not talking about fine dining or high-level cooking. In all kitchens, you have some strict deadlines that require a lot of collaboration and well-timed teamwork. That means that you must be able to rely on your teammates. That is how it also has a connection to sort of the military, as some people like to describe it. And when they do so, mostly it is in a negative way or with negative connotations. But I believe that what we have in common is that there is just no way around it. We must do some things at a certain time, in a certain way, with a certain degree of speed or timing. And you cannot be within a group where you have members of the team that are unreliable, that you cannot trust. So to mitigate that, people at times do bad things, as in it creates the opportunity for bullying. And I think that that's despicable in any way, but I think it's helpful to understand where that comes from. Now, if you go into this environment with this belief in fragility, you clearly will have a hard time, and you will clash with not only the former generation, but the circumstances that you're facing. With my upbringing, the world to me seemed so set in stone, and I was never given the idea or offered the aspirations to go change the world. What I was offered was a mindset to endure it. I was offered a framework to grow within it. So when I came into the restaurant industry, age 17, the first day my feet hurt, I knew that I had to work through it and I had to aspire to something much more than I had for me to be able to endure it, to deal with it. Now, if you think of yourself as fragile, and that whatever is discomfort or feels like discomfort feels wrong, then you will have a very difficult time in this environment. The second is the emotional reasoning. And I believe that we have culturally repeated this idea that you should always trust your gut feeling and you should go by your feelings and what do you feel like doing and so on and so on. And while it is worthy of sympathy to some extent, what it creates it clearly, and that the book states, is that it creates anxiety. Because once you narrow down the world into being only about subjective experiences, that what you have experienced is the only truth, and anyone that is challenging that is trying to gaslight you to some extent, then we have a hard time growing and reflecting and being challenged. I believe us versus them is such a broad topic on its own, and I think that it mostly refers to or is at least exacerbated by social media and the effect it has on people, that it requires a video on its own. The last thing we should do, honestly, is trust our feelings. My experience tells me that, honestly, all your feelings are there to do is to stop you from doing what you could do. I believe we need to somehow rationally get somewhere, understand what we want to achieve, and then try and commit to that process so that we can get through it, because our emotions are never going to get us into the right direction. A few years ago, I had a very important learning myself as a parent and for my own kid. My 14-year-old was at the time probably 11 or 12, and he was signed up for a BJJ competition. Now, he woke up devastated. He was afraid. He said he was sick. My stomach hurts. I'm not feeling good today, Papa. I don't think I shouldn't go to the competition. And let's be clear. Of course you're scared. You should be horrified. Because if you have been to a competition, and I have as an idiotic grown-up, but as a child you go to a room where there's a lot of yelling people and a lot of people in kimonos and gis and tights yelling at each other. And what you're supposed to do is to accept to go on the mat and face someone, most probably better than you, that is ready to fight, strangle you, or do a joint lock on you that is potentially breaking your limb. Now, that is not what happens in kids competition mostly, because there's very responsible trainers and referees out there. But of course you're horrified. Of course you're scared to death. And I had the feeling intuitively that I could not allow myself to allow him to stay at home. He could not call in sick on that one. I knew that this would be a decisive moment for his life. The problem was, how do you have the dearest person in your life, your son, your child, so tortured by fear and still get him through it without having them avoiding it? This is the trap we fall into as parents. I simply told him, listen, we're going to go. We're going to go to the competition and you're going to show up. And I understand that you are so scared, and it's completely fair that you are. I would be the same. What you can do is, as soon as you get onto the mat, as soon as you step your foot onto the mat and you fist bump the guy and the match starts, you can just tap out. You can tap out immediately, and I will be proud of you. And you should be proud of yourself because you showed up. If you don't want to do the fight, don't do the fight, but get on the mat. And he did it. We went there with the car, the Rocky soundtrack blasting. Now this is the Generation X coming back again. This idea of aspiring to someone facing adversity and working through it, and in the end succeeding. This was what I believe I had to present to him, and not accept on his behalf that he should avoid facing his fears. He had to confront it. And I helped him by holding his hand. We went through it, we got there, and as the match started, he didn't tap out. He found some level of energy that I think if no one or nothing pushes you there, if you are always somehow allowed to divert, you will. But if you're not, you have access to something within you that can do things that you did not believe were possible. And that is a tool that you will use the rest of your life. I was so proud of him. I had tears down my eyes, and I'm still touched thinking about it. And he was so proud of himself. It was unbelievable. I believe this tells me what is the biggest issue with this generation is that they have been promised a life that is not possible to achieve. They've been promised a life without adversity by a childhood that has been synthetic, that has been fake, and that has been defined by media more than culture. I'm not sure that I, as a leader, have been capable enough during my years to give people the leadership that I think that they deserved as Generation Zs. But I know for a fact that as a father, I will do everything I can to give what I believe is the right amount of leadership, which both gives you a push forward through adversity, but also is there to support and accept the fact that life is difficult and life is a struggle. And I think telling yourself and your kids and a generation that is growing up in the world they're growing up in today, that life is not a struggle and that they need to change that for anything else to happen, I don't think is going to secure them a better life. Quite the opposite.